Ladies and gentlemen, no, still. Hello. Okay. Tiamuko. Hello. Hi, ladies and gentlemen. Please, could you take your seats for the third session of the day? Thank you, everybody. So, for those who haven't, for the newcomers today, I'm George Richards from Art Jamil, the head of Heritage, and one of the partners with the Global Heritage Fund and Ikram Athar and AMENA of this conference. And it's my great pleasure to be chairing the third session of the day, during which we will be traveling extensively from the deeps and the mysteries beneath the seas of the Middle East and North Africa to the frontiers of cyberspace and the development of new technologies to support the documentation of heritage destruction and damage, and to the deserts of Syria, Libya, and Iraq, and stories of efforts to thwart threats to cultural heritage there. Our speakers are first Dr. Colin Breen from Ulster University in Coleraine, Northern Ireland, who will be speaking on documenting and protecting the maritime archaeological resource of the MENA and Gulf regions and the MENA project, followed by Andres Acosta and Surush Khanlou from the Global Heritage Fund talking about the Amal in Heritage platform, and then Rand Eppich talking on an overlooked threat to cultural heritage. So I'll first invite Dr. Breen to take the podium, but also ask everyone in the audience of whatever language speaking, at Dr. Breen's request, please to put on your headphones for simultaneous translation. So everybody, English, Arabic, French, please put on your headphones. Dr. Breen.
So this morning, at this morning's session, Maya talked about endangered languages, and we also had a session where the French spoke in solidarity with each other. So as a consequence, beg misha kainta squelga on Tom Galer and Shaw. Is misha asera, is misha colin overin, time makoni, a kulrahin, also kulrahin, August anov beg me kaint fui shandaliak fui hoen. Agus Bacart doing Countess Berla Shawmock. So for the benefit of the audience, I will speak in English from here in, but who thought that the translators could speak in Gaelic as well, so congratulations to them. Just a couple of things. The last few days, This is my first time speaking at a Protecting the Past conference, and I think one of the key things that I've got from this is the very strong legacy that EAMENA is beginning to develop. Up until a couple of years ago, the capacity that was available in many of these regions wasn't necessarily where it should have been. And I think that strategy that EAMENA has developed in tandem with the universities and their in-country partners is really progressing the subject and the documentation of the subject across this region. And I think one of the things that we're now beginning to start looking at is a new generation of EAMENA. And very specifically, what I want to speak about is the MAR EAMENA project. Much of what we've seen so far this morning and in yesterday's session has been about the terrestrial sphere, the terrestrial environment. And of course, we're conscious that archaeology, cultural resources, both tangible and intangible, aren't just focused in the terrestrial world. We also have extensive maritime resources, subsea resources within the marine environment. And Maramina has been established in an attempt to extend the existing EAMENA strategies and methodologies out into this maritime world. This is a partnership between ourselves at Ulster University in Northern Ireland and Southampton University in England, in working partnership with the existing EAMENA teams at Oxford, Leicester and Durham. And we're really grateful to the Arcadia Foundation and to Maya in particular for identifying this progression, this natural progression, I think, when we begin to start looking at the cultural resource that exists across this particular region. So what Maramina will do will operate in a very similar way to EAMENA, using very similar methodologies, but we're adapting them for the marine environment. So for the coastal zone, and we identify the maritime zone as that zone which is influenced by the sea. So we're also looking at the terrestrial zone up to about 15 to 25 kilometres inland. Any zone that is directly impacted by sea or maritime activities, and extending that out onto the seabed, onto the deep or the shallow water through to the deep water seabeds. There are different technologies and different ways of approaching this, but it's very much similar to the adaptation of the existing very successful strategies that have been identified through the existing EAMENA project. I should also note that while much of the last few days we focused on conflict and the damage that has been impacted upon the cultural resource through war and through violent conflict, within the maritime zone we're looking at, while conflict has an impact, yes, of course it does, but the majority of negative impacts in terms of resource pressures are coming from this phase of hyper-development that we're moving through within this region. Hyper-development from the massive expansion of marine exploration, the development of ports, harbours, and the movement of populations towards the coast. Many of those populations pushed not only by conflict, but also through economic necessity as you move towards the coast for employment and employment opportunities. But the second major threat that's facing the coastal and marine environment is, of course, climate and environment change. We recognise that this isn't a new phenomenon. This is something that has been happening for millennia right across the coastal and marine zone, but it's something that we are much more cognizant of when it comes to understanding the major threats and issues that are impacting this particular area. In the first instance, we will focus on these 5 survey blocks across the region. Again, these are arbitrary blocks at this moment in time, but we're essentially encompassing all of the marine area of these countries. And most of these countries have an exclusive economic zone of up to 200 miles as opposed to kilometres offshore. This isn't necessarily true for every country, but that's really from about 15 kilometres inland to about 250 kilometres offshore. Now, when we begin to start talking about the maritime cultural resource, what are we speaking about? We can probably group this into 4 general themes. In the first instance, we have those cultural sites which have become submerged for whatever reason, paleo-environmental landscapes, as well as settlement which may have previously been on terrestrial land, but which is now submerged underwater. We move through to theme 2, which encompasses coastal archaeology, that coastal strip, encompassing things like ports, harbours, fishing practices, coastal industry, all of these types of site types that we associate with people living on the coast. The third theme is very much focused on our nautical past, our shared nautical past, and this focuses on cultural sites like shipwrecks, traditional boat technology, marine artefacts that were associated with ship and shipbuilding practices. And then finally, we have theme 4, our intangible cultural heritage and intangible maritime traditions within the coastal zone, including things like folklore, traditional practice, and our belief systems. And even when it comes to, much of traditional archaeological practice is about mapping sites. with the traditional delimitation and polygons associated with database construction. But within the maritime zone, we're familiar with the fact that in many communities, while there may not be a physical site offshore, it is a place associated with gin and traditional practice, and it becomes a culturally important place for the coastal communities who are living and working within that area. So from our perspective, it's just as important to delineate these traditional areas of practice as it is to document and list those physical places associated with past and contemporary marine practice. When it comes to the types of sites we might expect to find, it can be everything from the incredible harbour resources and ancient ports associated with Alexandria off the north coast of Egypt. Most of us will be familiar with this. Down to submerged town sites like Pavlo Petri in the North Mediterranean coast, and this classical period site which has been subsided and is now underwater as a consequence of tectonic activity within this area, down to ports like Aden or more traditional shipwrecks on the seabed. So a very wide diversity of site types across this area. And I guess the importance of this type of activity was exemplified by an email I got this morning from a colleague in Turkey who is part of our broader network, who has just found the oldest shipwreck in the world, dating to about 17,000 BC, or about 4,000 years ago, which has just been found off the coast of Antalya in southern Turkey. And that's the type of site and the type of excitement that can be generated through this type of work. However, one of the challenges, and one of the questions that have been asked of us on a number of occasions was, well, why can't the existing EMENA team deal with many of these types of sites? And I guess much of the environment that we're dealing with requires specialist knowledge and specialist understanding. It's a very dynamic environment. It's an environment which is continually changing and subject to a whole variety of influences, both natural and anthropogenic. So when we begin to start looking at some of the environmental science which underpins these areas, we can look at the extensive amount of tectonic and seismic activity right across these areas. Each of these represents a seismic event, through to the changing sea level from the early Holocene right through to the present day. We're familiar as a consequence of contemporary climate change and environment change that sea level is changing, but sea level has always been in a constant state of flux. So when we begin to start looking out at the various proxies or variables which map out sea level change, we can see a whole variety of graphs representing different areas across the eastern Mediterranean where sea level has changed. And we can see from about 6,000 or 7,000 years ago, sea level has begun to start rising at quite a rapid rate in many parts of the eastern Mediterranean. About 7,000 years ago, sea level was lower by about 10 metres in much of the eastern Med, and then over the course of the following 6,000 to 7,000 years, we see quite rapid sea level rise up to present-day levels. And as a consequence of this, we're seeing the inundation and the radical change of many aspects of our coastal zone and our coastal environment. So when we go right back into the Paleolithic period, we can see that the nature of the maritime world was really quite different at that particular time. And when we begin to start moving into the Persian Gulf in particular, we'll see that this was actually dry in the lower Paleolithic period, with the resultant consequence of the potential to find early hominid remains and a whole variety of other things. We can also begin to start seeing environments which are very variable. So when we look at the bathymetry of the Red Sea, for example, in the middle of the Red Sea, sea depth, or the seabed is found at a depth of just over 2.5 kilometres, down to about 2,500 metres in depth. The Persian Gulf, or the waters of this particular part of the world, are significantly shallower. So we can see the southern shallows just off the UAE. The depths here come down to a maximum only of about 10 or 11 metres. So we're seeing very significant change and variation in terms of bottom type and variation as we move across these various areas. So very different worlds, very different maritime worlds. Just to give you a number of case examples and look to see where the genesis of this project came from, the original project started as a small-scale benchmarking project looking at post-conflict reconstruction in Syria, very specifically looking at the maritime cultural heritage resource within that coastal zone. This was a project which was funded by the Honor Frost Foundation, but the results of that project were integrated within the EAMENA database, very much following the principles of Arcadia's movement towards open access data. So all of the data that I will show here are now available within the EAMENA database, incorporated and funded by the HFF. So when we begin to start looking at the type of features that we were mapping as part of this process, many of these sites wouldn't have appeared within the existing terrestrial EAMENA base, so what we're looking is an extension of the existing terrestrial sites. And to date, we've added just over 330 new sites into the EAMENA base, which are very much maritime, or coastal sites, unique to the maritime world. The types of sites we've identified include classic tells and breakwaters, rock cut features which were used for a whole variety of things like storage, quarrying, the storage of fish, things like that, as well as submerged shipwrecks in shallow water environments. When we begin to start mapping these out, we can also take due cognizance of the way the maritime world changed. If we look in the northern part of this image, for example, in and around the Jebel area, we see this area which is now silted up, but during the Bronze Age, this would have been a marine incursion area. And then we can begin to start understanding the distribution of much of the Bronze Age material in and around this area, because it's directly associated with the way the environment has changed. The environment, the coastal environment that we're looking at today, is not representative of the coastal environments that would have existed across these lands over the last 10 to 12,000 years. When we begin to start looking at the issues and threats across this area, again, much of this area, we're seeing two satellite images. The image on your left is the Corona image dating to 1968, and this is the Esri satellite map dating from December 2015. And what we're seeing is really quite dramatic change across much of this landscape. Much of this process we're familiar already with EAMENA, and EAMENA has managed to map out much of this process across most of this area. We're seeing very rapid urban expansion, but much more specifically from a coastal perspective, we're seeing quite significant coastal change in places. So at the bottom of the image, we're seeing coastal retreat by anything up to 2 to 3 meters within the course of a 30-year period. So that process of a 3-meter change over 30 years, averaging a meter a year, is really quite dramatic and is reflective of changing agricultural practices, but also reflective of the changing nature of environment. We look at a second area, a second case study area. Again, extensive archaeological remains associated with maritime activity, and we've identified much of the area associated with the original Bronze Age harbour, which is now silted up from about 3,000 years ago. But when we begin to start looking at the contemporary map, we see that what we're seeing now is a reverse of that previous siltation. When we look at contemporary coastal shoreline, or this is, again in red, this is the coastal shoreline from the 1970s, and what we're seeing here is the contemporary shoreline from 2015. So again, quite dramatic change within this coastal environment as the coast ebbs and flows associated with environmental change, associated with climate change, but also much more specifically in this area associated with the anthropogenic changes conducted by the agricultural, or the intensification of agricultural activity within this particular area. So all of this then is beginning to start moving on. So we're documenting, we're in the process for the first time of documenting much of the maritime archaeological resource from many of these countries, which hasn't been done before. We've seen quite strong maritime archaeological activity taking place in certain areas, but the majority of the countries across this area have seen very little, if any, maritime archaeological work done. And it's beginning to start integrating that process of resource and site discovery, following through in our various field campaigns, looking at these sites in much more detail, conducting geophysical survey on an intensive basis at a number of case studies, reacting against rapid change or increased threat at major places, and then beginning to start moving towards suggesting avenues as an add-on to this project, looking at ways with which the resource can be better protected, the ways it can be better managed, and ultimately the ways which we can examine in terms of knowledge dissemination and the distribution of the types of information and data sets that we're getting out to the wider world and into the communities where these information, these data are required for the most part. So ultimately what we're looking at, and I think in many ways this image exemplifies the nature of change that has taken place within the maritime world. Most of us will be familiar with these images from Sharjah, dating to the early part of the 20th century, and the really profound and dramatic change that has occurred within this area. When we look at the traditional boat practices, the traditional ways that communities would have lived and worked in this area, in comparison to the massive industrialization, the intensification of settlement, and the intensification of activities, cultural activities, that have taken place across this region. What this new Arcadia project is doing is beginning to start redressing that imbalance, beginning to start and documenting these past changes in the hope of protecting them and documenting them for future prosperity. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Breen. That was a wonderful presentation, beautiful photograph there at the end, and fascinating bathymetric charts to illuminate the similarities, but also the differences between maritime archaeology and some of the other forms of digital documentation that we've been hearing about today and yesterday. Next, it is my pleasure to invite Andres Acosta and Surush Khanlu from the Global Heritage Fund to show us that there is hope, Amal in heritage.
All right, I am Surush Khanlu, and I'm the lead developer on Amal and Heritage. Good afternoon. My colleague Andres Acosta will be joining me here in a few minutes, but our goal today is to give you an idea of who we are and what we've been working on. Naturally, we wouldn't be where we are without the institutions and organizations that have helped support us. And those institutions are, of course, the Global Heritage Fund, which is the primary backer, the Prince, one moment. No, I've almost got it, sorry. I think so. Have I almost got it? This is here. This is, okay. Sorry, my notes still aren't there. All right, we should be good. All right, apologies. We wouldn't be where we are without the support from the organizations and institutions that make Amal possible. Those organizations include the Global Heritage Fund, which is the primary backer of Amal, as well as the Prince Claus Fund, ICORP, ICOMOS, and UNESCO. So to start, many of you know who we are, but we'd like to give a brief primer for those who don't. We'd like to talk about what Amal is. While a lot of the other presenters have focused on highly specialized hardware, such as LiDAR or satellite mapping, drones, and other such tools, we at Amal are focused on the lower end of the market. There's a device that almost every one of us carries with us, and it has a wide array of sensors and communication technologies, and it can be used to do effective archaeology. So what we do is we take a design-focused approach to app development, ensuring that we're inclusive of all of the people who are experts in the field, as well as those who are not experts in the field. What Amal is a set of tools and a training program designed for use during disasters. By using the features of the mobile devices that we all carry around, features like the camera, like the GPS and the compass, and intuitive interfaces that we can build, we can replace traditional pen and paper techniques to make data collection faster, less error-prone, and better for groups of teams. So this is how we look at the work that we do. We call this the disaster management cycle. Previously, we were more focused on the left half of this cycle, post-disaster, working on rapid impact assessment after an incident. However, there's also a strong need for pre-disaster mobile tools. In a world with barbaric conflict and disastrous climate change, as we saw in the presentation before, these things are more important than ever. The Amal program starts from the top right of this cycle with training programs and capacity building for areas that are sort of pre-incident, and then tools for documenting the disaster rapidly and enabling a quick response and a smooth recovery. You heard from David and Salima earlier. They're working with local communities in the Moroccan regions to document and preserve the historic granaries that are there. The process of desertification in Morocco is a slow disaster, but a disaster nonetheless. And documenting the current state of those granaries is one way to stem that tide. We have been talking to Salima and David, and we call them our super users. We stay very close with them, making sure that we build the features that they need so that we can stay in contact with the people who use our software, and we can make sure that our software is useful for those who are using it in the field. So that's sort of what Amal is, but why do we think it's important? Here's an example of a team using traditional pen and paper techniques. These techniques for recording and gathering data are a little bit slower, a little bit more expensive, and in an emergency situation, you really need the most rapid assessment of the situation as possible. So digital documentation being a theme of this conference, we need to look at why do we like these digital tools? Why do we like mobile technology? Here's an example of a phone and a clipboard. When we look at what paper is good at versus what paper is bad at, we see that in a lot of the cases where paper suffers, mobile can really help us. So for example, if you're in the field with a clipboard, you're going to need a separate device as a GPS and a separate device as a camera. Whereas something like a mobile device, all of those things are all in one. Users that don't necessarily own a GPS probably own a mobile telephone. Not only do you have to own these devices, you also have to carry them with you, which can be a little bit cumbersome. Again, with the mobile device, it's all in one, so you don't have to carry 3 things, you only have to carry 1 thing. When you have the data on the phone, it's immediately ready to be transmitted anywhere it needs to go. As long as you have cellular reception or Wi-Fi reception, you can send the data anywhere it needs to go. Paper requires a trip back to the office, perhaps you're scanning it or faxing it, and that adds to the process. Likewise, also copying it is a bit of a challenge. With mobile devices and electronic technology, you can immediately copy things and have them be anywhere they need to be, whereas with paper and clipboard techniques, you need to copy them using a copy machine, probably back at the office. So our goal here is Really not to get rid of the clipboard. Pen and paper still has lots of advantages. For example, paper doesn't run out of batteries. You can read paper in the sun. Paper doesn't overheat. But we want to be able to balance all of the positives of the new technology with all the positives of the old technology and make sure that we balance that trade-off and make something that's useful for everyone. Lastly, working with paper, a little bit harder to edit, especially if you need to insert words. Computers make that a little bit easier. So a lot of you were at the Protecting the Past conference in Tunisia last year, and you want to know what we've been up to for the last year. So we've been working on a number of things. We've sort of set a roadmap for ourselves of where we want to take the product of Amal in the future. The roadmap is essentially 3 phases, versions 1, 2, and 3. Version 1 is where we are now. That's sort of Amal for individuals. That's data collection on the device. That's the ability to capture images. That's the ability to create reports, edit them from the desktop once you're back at the office. But then once that's done, once we built that, we realized there was actually a bit of a hole in the product. And what we realized was that when you're in the field with a team, these phones really need to be able to communicate together. If you've already assessed something, your teammate also doesn't need to go and assess it. If your teammate is documenting safety hazards, you need to know that those safety hazards are there. And so building a product where each device communicates with every other device is extremely important. So that's where we want to go with version 2 of Amal. Version 3 of Amal, we call Amal for organizations. This involves project-based features so that, once you've assessed a region once, perhaps you're going to assess it multiple times, and those multiple assessments become a project, and they represent a sort of organization-level approach to the area that you're assessing. So that's sort of our broad vision for where we want things to go. Now for a little bit of concrete details. One thing we've been working a lot on is Android. Android is hugely important for this region, as I'm sure you all know. Even the Google blog for Android developers says that 75% of the smartphones in this region are Android phones. So 75% is a huge, huge number, and it's very valuable for us to make sure that we're on that platform and working with it. However, working with Android is a little bit challenging. There's many different manufacturers. As you can see, many screen sizes. Each manufacturer has its own camera. There are also many versions of the operating system. Our job is to make sure that we have one application that works in every single one of those environments. Now, that's a challenge, but that's something that we've been able to overcome with what we call a test lab. A test lab is a large number of Android devices that we can use to run our app on to make sure that different manufacturers, different cameras, and different operating systems all work smoothly. We've also, in the last year, been relying on the rest of the software development community to help us solve really hard problems like making sure the camera works well for everybody. We're proud this year to report that our Android app has come a long way. Back in Tunisia, we really only had a beta with the bare number of features. Now we've rewritten the camera to support a lot more devices. We've added a lot more of the features that our users expect, and we fixed a lot of bugs that only happen on certain devices from certain manufacturers. And we've done one more thing as well. I know this chart is a little bit hard to read, but this is each Android version that Google releases is represented here by one color. So we are all the way at the end. That's the last survey was February 2018. And the app that we had ready in Tunisia only covered the purple and the pink parts. So it's still more than half, which is not bad. But we're going to do a little bit better than that. Here's the same data in tabular form. You can see that these later versions are about 50%, a little more, 55%. But we've actually dropped the requirements so that our app will run on more phones. So if you have an older phone, Amal is more likely to work on your phone. And what that means is when you look at this graph, we now cover everything up to the bright red. So that's almost 95% of devices. So that's really great. So that's our update on Android. We also have a partnership that we'd like to talk a little bit about. We call this Hairbridge. Hairbridge is a partnership with EMENA, between Global Heritage Fund and EMENA. And what Heritage is it's a way for users in the field, often lay people, to collect information on sites where EMENA is unsure if it's an archaeological site or not. And they can send people who live on the ground and have them upload photos to Heritage and then check those photos in order to see if they're valuable. And if they are valuable and prove the existence of an archaeological site, then they can include that in the EMENA database. So they can guide the user through installing the app, having it load, capturing data, uploading data, and then from the EMENA side, a staff user can come into Heritage. They can log in, and they'll see all the data associated with a specific EMENA resource, and then eventually submit that, and basically they'll have access to that data. This helps build confidence in the data that EMENA is looking at, because when you're looking from a satellite, you don't always know for sure what you're looking at, and this can help with that confidence. So we believe that Heritage and Amal are going to be valuable tools for EMENA, and we look forward to working with them more in the future. We're very proud of this collaboration, and in particular, I'd like to thank Andrea, who's sitting in the back there, who helped spearhead this project from the EMENA side. If you have a similar project where you think you could benefit from data capture from mobile tools in your regions that you're particularly interested in, we would love to talk to you. We think Amal does a really great job in situations like this. I'd now like to invite my colleague Andres Acosta on stage to talk a little bit about user safety in the Amal program.
Thank you, Suresh. All right, following the last Protecting the Past conference, we had two priorities. One was obviously the shift to a real strong focus on Android. I'm happy to say I'm no longer an iPhone owner, I am an Android phone owner. The other fact is that we understood that safety was a very, very important concern, especially dealing with rapid impact assessment and the whole disaster management wheel. So it's something that we not only took a strong look at, we actually went even further. We actually worked directly with first responders in San Francisco, but also thinking much broad-minded about how we would approach any situation and learn from the first responses' take on safety. And one of the things that we discovered was a community emergency response team program. This program enabled us to be able to look at responding to a disaster from a community's perspective. How would they support first responders? How could we actually do it and not endanger the lives of these supporters? So one of the things that I did in response to that program was I actually went through about a 4-month process of getting certified and going day by day and going through a number of exercises, and with a particular focus on documentation, but then also safety. So as you see from this photo, it was very hands-on, and we were able to get a lot of learnings from the program. The program also did make extensive use of paper, forms, and clipboards. So that was something that was somewhat surprising, but then at the same time, looking at it from the heritage perspective, I found a lot of learnings from that. One thing in particular was that there was this magical form, and it was a form called Form 100. And essentially, this form is a blank piece of paper. So when we could not fill out something on this form, we could always write it down on our own. And I can't tell you how helpful this was in terms of taking the learnings back to Amal and trying to implement some of those features with our preset forms. So this is something that we are going to be building upon and making, especially for when you're doing assessments in hazardous situations. It's very empowering to be able to have the option of adding something that maybe doesn't fit within the preset guidelines of that form. The other thing, too, the big learning that we took away from this program was that certs don't get hurt. And you know what? I think I'm going to take this same exact phrase and say that Amal users don't get hurt. I really want to make sure that we're not putting people in unnecessary danger, and a series of features that we have coming in Amal 2.0 and Amal 3.0 for organizations are going to address these. The other thing is certs are volunteer. They don't get paid. So after I finished the certification, I said, well, I had a number of notes, much more than I can cover in a short talk, but these are just a few of the things that we implemented. Number one thing is, before going into any disaster scenario, any situation for that matter, even pre-disaster, you need to check before you go. You need to be able to look at the tools that you have, at the hazards in front of you, and make a determination as to whether you're just going to take a photo from afar or go inside. And it's very important that training is imperative in that thing, to be able to address whether something is dangerous or not. And to be honest, a lot of the stuff that I've seen, a lot of the photos that I've seen of people assessing heritage sites, oftentimes you see that there are a number of dangers there, and you want to make sure that people understand how to evaluate those risks before going in. And we're going to help with that. We have a number of user guides that can help with assessing and hazardous situations before going in, and that's something that will be accessible to everyone who uses a mall. The other thing is teams of 2. I had always known that it was recommended to have teams of 2. I never knew it was mandatory. So this is something that there's a structure in terms of how to work with small teams, and teams of 2 are really the golden ratio when it comes to actually going in and having a safe assessment versus a potentially unsafe one. So some of the features we're evolving in Amal 2.0 is a number of features that will really unlock with 2 people assessing rather than 1, and also making it mandatory to have a watcher and somebody who's a keeper. So somebody who's a safety watcher and the other person who's a record keeper. And the last is addressing safety first and safety later. So when safety is addressed last, it will make sure that if there is any incident, any safety incident that happens in your report, that is documented, and that every Amal user can learn from that and can make sure that it actually is something that everyone can adopt later. So in closing, after this session, after the coffee break, please join us at the Digital Documentation Showcase, where we have Amal for web, we have Amal mobile, and we also have Hairbridge, which Soroush presented on. So please come over, bring your questions. We'd be happy to talk with you about it. Thank you for your time.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Soroush and Andres, for fascinating presentation on Amal. And yes, exactly as Andres was just saying, after this session, there'll be quick coffee and then the showcase just next door through that door, where you will have the chance to discover Amal, Airmena, and more information on the digitization of the granaries, about which we heard from Slima and David earlier. But before that, next we have Rand Epich, wherever he is, to discuss an overlooked threat to cultural heritage. Rand.
Well, I know I am the last today, so thanks for hanging in there, and thank you for the invitation, Zaki. Thank you. I really I'm so happy to be back here at Athar and participating. That one. Well, I have to say I'm also presenting on behalf of Ana Almagro, who sends her regards, and she wishes she could be here. I can move over here. She wishes she could be here, but she's occupied. Together, we have worked only in about half of the region. We consider ourselves fortunate to have worked in about half, so we really only know about half of it. Okay, which one is it? That one. Okay. Well, of course, the first thing that we think about when we think about this region are the horrible things that are happening. Our sympathies and our frustrations go out to those who are dealing with these situations. It's always heartbreaking to see these images, but this is the first thing you think about when you think about this region. And some of the presentations have highlighted this. However, I don't want to speak about conflict or heritage damaged due to conflict, but I want to speak about another threat that we often overlook.
and that is inadequate management. All 19 states in this region specifically mention severe problems with management. There's almost 400 reports at 55 World Heritage properties. Now, I'm only talking about World Heritage, but because there's a lot of data about World Heritage. But this can be correlated with all the other types of heritage. So if there's problems with management at World Heritage, there's probably management problems at other heritage sites. A lot of these sites report problems with management over decades. And now this is to compare how many reports. There's only 76 reports that specifically mention war, terrorism, or civil unrest. So you're looking at 5 times the number of sites reporting problems with management. Here's some examples. I was able to go through the database, State of Conservation database, which is quite rich. Well, Thebes in Egypt reports for 9 consecutive years problems with management. Here's a quote from the World Heritage Center. A number of high priority decisions have not been implemented or planned. Oman, 16 consecutive years it reports problems with management. The management plan was completed in 2010, but it hasn't been implemented. And this has happened a lot, where there's management plans, usually with help from outsiders, but not implemented or adopted. The latest reactive monitoring mission mentions that it needs a local management office. Volubilis, which I had the privilege of working at last year for a week or so, and I was in touch with Gaetano Palumbo. There is a management plan, and I got a copy of it. It's an excellent management plan, but it's not been implemented. Yet, you know, I didn't get the impression that management was a serious problem there. Of course, it can be improved, but in Rabat, where I also did some preliminary work, wonderful management plan, but yet, you know, and this is my pet peeve, my pet problem, that we have this huge Zaha Hadid structure going up in the buffer zone. And believe it or not, I searched for a reactive monitoring mission about this and couldn't find one. Anyway, okay. So to compare against other regions, looking at other places that report problems with management, and unfortunately this region comes out at the bottom. 67% of World Heritage sites report problems with management. And you can compare that with Africa, where it's only half. So the region reports problems with management more than any other region, and it reports it more frequently. Now, the State of Conservation database, which is very useful and informative, they have these 14 categories of different threats. Of course, threat number 9, you would expect, you know, other human activities, conflict, problems with terrorism. But this is the one I'm going to focus on, 13, management and institutions. Now, within that threat, there are secondary factors which contribute to that threat. So the number 1 threat for heritage sites, World Heritage, we can make a correlation with others, but number 1 threat, management. And then the number 1 problem within management, this sort of contributing threat, is management systems and management plans, the secondary factor. And it's reported 345 times. So my question was, why? Why is this reported so often? Because some of the places I've been to, the management isn't that bad. So why? And of course, I have to use this as a correlation because I don't know in depth all of the heritage sites. So inadequate management is listed at, nearly twice as often as other events. But, you know, this region's not alone. There's problems with management at all other sites. Very interesting report by UNESCO recently, well, 2014. 3 out of 4 properties on the World Heritage List are negatively impacted by significant management, insufficient management. It's widespread. It gives you an idea, the total number of reports for all World Heritage sites. So it is at the top. So if you were to say, what's the number one problem with heritage? It's not conflict, it's management. And give you some examples here. I frequently travel to Dubrovnik, and it never had a management plan. Millions of visitors a year, doesn't have a management plan. They just recently finished it. I just got a copy of it recently. But it took the reactive monitoring missions, ICOMOS, and the World Heritage Center, many visits, many reports that say, please submit your management plan. And of course, the Game of Thrones doesn't help. It's really quite disturbing to see Game of Thrones tours in Dubrovnik. But Westminster in the UK, so wealthy, high-income nations also are lacking with management plans. The reactive monitoring mission said further request to the state party to finalize their management plan. They have since done it, but recently, only recently, in this year. I was just in London, and it's covered in scaffolding. But The Guardian declared it as one of the most disappointing tourist attractions. So management is a problem everywhere, particularly in this region. So why is it a problem? Why do the states in this region report it more often? Is it a cultural difference? Is it just that there's management plans and they're not implemented? And is this data giving the real picture? And then, of course, is management just a category that everyone just blames management? It's easy. I'll give you some ideas of why I think this is, some theories. Lack of resources, and this one's easy. Everyone says, we just don't have enough money to manage properly. And some of the quotes from the individual sites bear this out. You know, at Giza, which has reported this problem over many years, you know, they just say, we just don't have enough money. And then if you look at the reverse, those sites that do have management plans, it's the higher income countries. All of the heritage sites in Saudi Arabia have management plans. And in the Gulf region, they all have management plans. So you would think if the wealthier, higher income countries have management plans, it must be the problem, right? But, you know, this is too easy to say they just don't have enough money. I don't think we could have all the money in the world and it wouldn't solve this particular problem. Is it lack of knowledge or skill? This too, I think, is too easy an answer. In Menkes, they specifically say there's need for institutional capacity building. And this is supported by research. There's been a series of reports by Luca Zahn from the University of Bologna, and he says that, you know, we're trained as conservators, as architects, as archaeologists, we're not trained in management. So this would lead you to believe that it's just a problem. But I think we have to look deeper than that. Have management plans become too ambitious? I think this is a likely candidate. I know this is not in the region, but it's close by. I'm working in Makli in Sindh in Pakistan. They just finished their management plan of 7 volumes. It's 100 pages per volume, 700 pages of management plan. I think it's a bit of overkill. In fact, it's so much information, it's not useful. So we're doing a new management plan, an abbreviated management plan. Or is it lack of political will? Or is it that there's no set formula for a management plan? Or is it just a boring topic? Do management plans include the right information? I looked at all of the completed management plans in the region, and only 2 had any type of financial information, which I thought was a bit strange. How can you call it a management plan if you don't know how it's going to be paid for, or if you don't know if it will be sustainable? Without funding, it's not going to be sustainable. According to the Nature Conservancy American Alliance for Museums, these are the 5 pillars. I looked for all of these things in the management plans, and most of them didn't have it. Okay, so where is all this going? Of course, the topic, which I'm really interested in the conference, is from documentation to management. Well, documentation is a very first important step. Recording the sites and the conditions and the problems, history, significance. But then the situation has to be managed. What do you do with that information? One of the speakers in the last session mentioned this. I think it's very important because information for its own sake is just information. We need to act on it. And without management, the documentation is an academic exercise. It's really good. It's good for exhibitions, but we need to use that to act. Well, yeah, there you are. I put you in at the last minute, the last line. Well, we want to preserve the original. We want to use that information to manage the site. Well, too often the documentation, it's focused on capturing the physical attributes, the context, the condition or environment with images, graphics, maps, digital. We've seen a lot, and they're really impressive. The fantastic 3D models that we saw yesterday, the satellite images from UNOSAT, of course the drone videos. I'm afraid I don't have any of those in this presentation, so maybe management is a bit boring. The laser scans is really fantastic, but we have to use that. So a much more difficult task is to use that information to manage the site, to improve management. And then what I say is to document the management. What indicators? How are we going to make sure that we're achieving our goals if we don't document the management? I mean, this state of conservation database is a good first start, but it's a very macro level. We need something at an individual site level. The periodic reporting system is good, but of course these are only for World Heritage sites. These are only for those sites that are very, very significant and with universal outstanding values. There's nothing that exists lower down. There are for museums and for collections, but not for sites. So I think we need some performance indicators, capacity to measure perspectives and monitor results over time to make sure that management is accomplishing its goals. And then documenting such attributes and indicators it's quite hard. It's easier to, I think it's easier to make a laser scanner than evaluate management with documentation. So clearly, in concluding, there's certainly management problems, whether this gives the full picture or not. There's management problems. I think that Athar and ICCROM, they have their work cut out for them with both these twin problems of being in a region with half the World Heritage in danger list. You have half of it. But also, on top of it, you have the worst set of management situations in the region. The issues, I think, with management are a combination of these things that I mentioned. Oops. What did I do? You know, there's some possible ideas. The documentation, I think it must be captured with an idea that it's going to help management. There needs to be an emphasis on management systems rather than management plans. If you look at what the operational guidelines say, they do not say you need a management plan. You need a management system. And it also mentions, importantly, that there's different cultural perspectives, resource, and other factors. I think a management system can be a halfway point to a management plan. I think we've gone too far with management plans that have to be all-inclusive, all-encompassing. I think we need to return to the basics to address this situation with management. One of my favorite books, very simple book, and I think we need to return to that simple idea of management. I think the rhetoric needs to be simplified, and I'm guilty of this myself, that the language is often confusing, especially for non-English speakers. I think that management systems must include financial details, how it's going to be paid for, how it's going to be sustainable. And then finally, I think with this group of people, maybe it's not as exciting as laser scanning or drone videos, but we have to develop a documentation system for documenting the management. You know, who is the manager? How is it going to be managed? What are the risks? And that's it. Thank you. finish on time. I know it went very quickly, but I'm around all tomorrow, so we can keep talking.
That's great. Please take a seat at the... Yes. So I'm going to invite our other speakers to join me on the podium, on the dais for the discussion. So Andres, Soroush, Dr. Breen, if you'd like to come up, and yeah, we'll have a chat. So I'll open it up to the floor in a minute because we're slightly shorter of time than planned. But one question I had to the speakers was about adoption. So just coming off Rand's presentation then, obviously heritage management plans have been advocated by the World Heritage Committee, but in many places haven't been adopted, and I know that there's now work underway to adopt them. But then to the other panelists, Amal and Heritage is a new technology, which you'll hope will be adopted widely. And similarly with the approaches to maritime archaeological documentation, the Mariamena project, you want this to be adopted similarly by various countries and practitioners in the region. So, question to all panelists, how do you encourage adoption of different technologies and techniques? And perhaps we'll start with you, Rand, since that was an important part of your presentation.
How do you repeat for me?
Question is, how do you encourage adoption of particular technologies or techniques, whether it's heritage management plans or Amal and heritage platforms or the approaches to maritime archaeological recording, which Dr. Breen mentioned?
I mean, for mine, it's not technological, I think, but I think if they see good examples, particularly in connection with digital documentation, if they see that that laser scan can help them better manage the site or identify issues, it can be adopted with good examples. I mean, I was thinking the other day, maybe even, I mean, institutions like that are present here can even have small teams that as they go to these sites, they can also infuse this issue of management.
Yeah, for us, I think that adoption is a slightly different problem. You mentioned that it's not technological, it's more of a social problem, and I think that's the right way of thinking about it. You can build it, they say if you build it, they'll come. This doesn't end up always being true. I come from a perspective of a more, I come from the field of technology rather than the field of archaeology. And so I need you all to teach me about the archaeology. But from the technology perspective, what we try to do first is we try to have really small experiments that prove that a concept works. And once you prove that the concept works, then the only job is to get it to as many people as possible. So I feel like Amal is still in the stage where we're trying to find the right pieces and put them together in the exact right ways that the system actually works, and we can actually put this thing in the hands of someone who isn't savvy in terms of the field of archaeology, but can still do effective work. And once we can figure out that formula, then we can worry about adoption. But first we need something that works really well for everyone involved. That's sort of my perspective.
They don't get discouraged if it doesn't work well.
That's right. It's not their fault. It's our fault.
Dr. Breen.
Colin. For me, I guess most of my work is from sub-Saharan Africa, and it's not necessarily the issue with the technology and the management plan itself, it's the actual implementation and engagement. You know, most of this, because it's consultant-led or it's external, there's lots of money invested in this process, but it's moving beyond that. You know, every single World Heritage site across sub-Saharan Africa has had 2 or 3 decades of management plans. Has anything actually changed in any of them? Possibly not. So, you know, maybe we need to start moving beyond that Western paradigm of management-led approaches towards much more engaged work that guarantees the implementation and engagement with this process.
Absolutely. I just wanted to reiterate what my colleague mentioned with regards to adoption. It's really responsible adoption. We have an incredible distribution platform in the forms of these mobile app stores. The Google Play Store and the Apple App Store reach millions and millions of people instantly. I mean, you have on mobile phones games that launch sometimes in the morning, and then by the evening they're on the news and almost in everyone's pockets. So it's important to use those platforms with responsibility, and much like my colleague had mentioned, to make sure that we deploy what is going to be useful to the right audience. And one of the things that we did in doing that responsibly is not deploying freely to the App Store. We decided to do a more, I guess, a more staged rollout where we have an early access program. If you go to amal.global, you'll see that you can join that early access program, and we'll give you access to Amal. So it's not just going on the Apple App Store and searching for Amal. You actually fill out this form, and we send you the guidelines on how to use the app, and then we actually give you the link to download and install the app on your phone. It's entirely accessible to everyone as well, making sure that we support more devices. That does help adoption as well, but more importantly, the responsible adoption is really important.
Thank you. And I'll open it up to questions from the audience. Does anybody have any questions? One at the back.
Yeah, about adoption, and I mean that was a great session, everybody. Thank you. And it's really so that the people can see that if they don't do it, they'll benefit. There will be a disbenefit. So it's. I remember when I was a regional director for English Heritage, and during the winter, because it rains in England apparently, cleaning out your gutters is really important. If you don't clean out your gutters, it's going to be worse than if you do. If you see what I mean. So it's making people realise that actually adopting it is good for them. And talking of which, last year I adopted Amal on my phone and got the beta thing on my iPhone, and I just had a look at it and thought, can I use it? Can I use it on my iPhone? It says the beta testing has expired. So I'll be coming to see you afterwards.
Please save all technical questions for all technical support for later, please.
Any other questions? Yes, a few here. One at the front.
شكرا. كنت قد سمعت في السنة الفارطة على تطبيق أمل، وحاولت منذ أول سنة هذه السنة 2018 تحميل هذه التطبيقة والعمل بها، ولكني حاولت عدة محاولات إلى درجة أني يأست يعني الآن، وقد سمعت عن التغيرات اللي قمت بهم. هل يشمل ذلك جميع أنواع الهواتف ويمكننا الآن التحميل، أو مازال يعني هناك فما ديزيكسيبسيون؟ فما بالنسبة للسؤال الثاني هو للسيد كولين. فقط أود أن أعرف لماذا نسبتم المستوطنات التي وجدت يعني بعد ارتفاع منسوب الخط الساحلي، ارتفاع منسوب المياه وتقدم الخط الساحلي، لماذا نسبتموها كلها إلى الفترة اللولوسين، في حين أن الفترة البليستوسين يعني فيها فترات رطبة مثل تشابه تلك اللي في اللولوسين. الفايف إي هي مشابهة تماما لفترة اللولوسين، يعني فترة رطبة ونفس نفس كل شيء. على ماذا اعتمدتم لتحديد هذه الفترات؟ شكرا.
Okay, I think, sorry, yeah. I can start by answering the Amal stuff. Part of, do you have an Android phone or an iPhone? Oh, Samsung, yeah, Android. iPhones are almost all the same, and Android phones are all different. And so every time we have a problem with one of the phones, we fix it, but it may not fix it for every phone. And so the best thing that you can do is tell us, write us an email, and give us some specifics about what phone you have, what you are trying to do, and we can make sure that we fix it for your phone. And then also if we need to get an extra phone for our test lab, test labs so that we can test it in the future to make sure that it works. So the more information we have, the easier it is for us to solve any problems that you have. Yeah. So write us an email.
Yeah, apologies, I should have been more specific in terms of the areas that I was discussing. So much of the submerged settlement that you saw in the imagery came from the northern region. So you're looking at different processes, and that's mostly associated with seismic activity. And this has come, the dating evidence there in terms of the Bronze Age has come from the key sea level indicators associated with change, geomorphological change in that particular area. The other element of it is that in the southern region, there's different processes within that area. So we have Neolithic submerged settlement of that, the countries south of Lebanon, for example. So it's just dependent on the area where you're at and the key indicators of change that we're looking at.
One more thing just to add. Thank you for being an early access user and giving us a try earlier in the year. Earlier in the year, we actually didn't have Amal on Android publicly available or available via the Play Store. So it's possible you could have filled out the form and been sent a link to install the application. Now, if you just on your phone go to the Google Play Store and search for Amal in Heritage, you will see a page for Amal and saying it's an early access program, and you can try and install it again. It's possible. You just need to reinstall. Yeah.
Just time for one final question, Abdurrahman.
I actually have 3 questions for Colin. The first question is, you said that the waters can be as shallow as the depth of the sea can be 10 meters. What is the risk of looting in such a shallow water? The second question is, you showed quite extensive, massive area. Do you have active network in those areas that you indicated in the map? The third question is, it's a bit confusing when you said that it's overland for 50 kilometers. Who do you imagine will be responsible? Is it, you have in the cultural heritage community, you have movable heritage, immovable, underwater, and now you have something in between. Who will be responsible for managing that heritage? Thank you.
Thanks for those questions. In terms of, looting to me is very similar in the context of what Rand was talking about in terms of conflict. Looting, while it's a problem underwater, isn't the major problem. When we begin to start looking at fishing activity, for example, and dredging and trawling, most of the seabed, every square centimeter of the seabed is covered nearly every part of the year by continual fishing activity. Exploration activity is much more of an intensive impact upon the seabed. So yes, looting is an issue, but commercial development is a far bigger problem for us. In terms of your second question, or maybe your third question first, that notion of inland, why did we pick that figure? That figure has really come from coastal zone managers. In order to try and make this easier for themselves, most coastal zone management specialists will say that the coastal zone extends for about 15 to 25 kilometers inland. So that's very much an arbitrary figure for us. You're absolutely right. It's no basis in cultural fact. It's simply a management figure that we've plucked out of nowhere. And your mid-question, I've forgotten, was about... network, sorry, apologies. Yeah, so one of the key challenges, one of the advantages for us in terms of working in partnership with AMENA is that we will hope to build on those existing partnerships that AMENA have been working with. We have already started integrating. Tomorrow I travel to Beirut to work with the Cultural Protection Fund training program that's working there. So we're introducing a maritime module into that, and a maritime module hopefully will be part of all future training programs. But we also have our own networks, but we would hope to begin a process of negotiation and discussion and introduction to all of those countries as well that are included in this area as part of our initial phases.
We are out of time, actually. We're sorry. Okay, one quick question.
Will Amal work underwater?
Yes.
photography works underwater. Yeah, yeah.
Protecting the Past 2020, new version of Amal underwater.
Okay, well, we have a new challenge for the ML team to end our discussion. So if you join me with a round of applause for our speakers. Thank you very much. And before you go and grab your quick coffee, a few housekeeping announcements.
Oh, there's a button. Wow. Just a couple of announcements. We've run a little bit over time, so indeed grab a quick coffee and come straight to the digital showcase, which is in the room over there, to come and see the various presentations. But also after that, we don't want to cut too much into the digital documentation showcase, because we will have the buses arriving at 4:30 sharp to take us on the cultural tour and then on to the gala dinner, the conference gala dinner. Now, there will be 2 different groups going on the cultural tour in 3 different buses, so this is mathematically quite interesting. And the idea is that group 1, which will be 2 buses, will go to one side of the cultural tour, and group 2, which will be 1 bus, goes to the other side, and we will cross each other during the tour and then go in the other person's buses on the way to the dinner in the Ajamil Center. Does this make sense? Yes? Well, anyway, myself and Michael and Julia and the other organizers will be around at the buses at 4:30 to try and distribute you evenly over the 3 buses so that we all get where we have to go. But please, if you want to come, don't be late, be there at 4:30. And meanwhile, have a quick coffee, enjoy the digital showcase.